Night fell upon the small inland town like a heavy cloak, one that muffles sounds and makes each light seem isolated from the rest of the world. The streets were almost empty, illuminated by old lampposts that flickered with a low, constant hum, as if they too were tired of staying awake. The cold wind swept across the main avenue, carrying dry leaves and the distant smell of gasoline, wet wood, and silence. It was in this setting that Mark William Richard walked. Slow steps, tense shoulders, his gaze always alert, not out of habit, but for survival. He was a war veteran, and this was not just a detail of the past. It was something that manifested itself in every movement, in every calculated pause before crossing a corner, in every held breath when a car passed too fast. Mark paused for a moment under the yellowish light of a lamppost, his worn coat buttoned up to his neck. His face bore marks that didn't show up in photographs, deep lines around his eyes, a constantly clenched jaw, as if always prepared for an imminent impact. He observed the emptiness before him with the same intensity with which, years before, he had observed foreign horizons, waiting for something to move where nothing should move. The silence of that city was not peace. It was just another kind of noise. A noise that a war veteran had learned to fear because it reminded him too much of the seconds before everything collapsed. The city slept, but Mark didn't. War veterans rarely sleep like other people. Sleep, when it came, was light, fragmented, full of shadows that crept in uninvited. He took a deep breath, feeling the cold air burn his lungs slightly, and for a brief moment closed his eyes. Not to rest, but to make sure he was still there, that the asphalt beneath his feet was real, that the distant sound of a train was just a train, not a disguised memory. In the distance, a church bell marked the hour with slow, deep chimes. Each sound echoed within him as a reminder that time continued to move forward, indifferent to the fact that, for Mark William Richard, parts of life had remained frozen in deserts, destroyed villages, and moonless nights. He opened his eyes again, fixing them on the empty street, and continued walking. There was something in the air that night, an almost imperceptible feeling, but one that a war veteran instinctively recognized. The certainty that the calm would not last. The facades of the closed shops reflected his silhouette, distorted in the old glass. In one of them, Mark saw his own reflection for a second longer than usual. A solitary man, hardened by time and war, carrying a past that no one in that city seemed willing to see. He quickly looked away. He had learned on the battlefield that staring too long could mean hesitation, and hesitation was costly. Even now, in a seemingly tranquil American city, the war veteran within him refused to let his guard down. The wind picked up, making a sign creak above a closed diner. The metallic sound made Mark stop again, his body reacting before his mind. His senses sharpened, his heart raced for a moment, and then came control. Always control. That was how he'd survived since returning home, controlling every reaction, every memory, every impulse. But that night, something escaped that control, like an invisible crack slowly forming. Mark leaned for a moment against the wooden fence that bordered a small park. The swings creaked softly, moved by the wind, empty, abandoned. The image struck something deep inside him. Children should occupy those spaces, not shadows and silence. He felt a tightness in his chest, an old, familiar sensation that usually preceded memories he preferred to keep buried. As a war veteran, he knew how to recognize signs, and this was a silent warning that his life was about to be pulled out of the cold, predictable routine he had built to keep himself functional. A car slowly passed in the background, its headlights cutting through the darkness, and disappeared around the next corner. Mark followed the movement until the light completely dissipated. When darkness returned, he had the strange feeling of no longer being alone in this story, even without seeing anyone around. It was as if fate was rearranging itself piece by piece, preparing something that would demand more from him than vigilance and resistance. He straightened his posture, crossed the park, and resumed his walk. Each step echoed in the emptiness of the street, heavy, laden with meaning. Mark William Richard, a war veteran, didn't know it yet, but that night marked the beginning of something that would test not only his skills learned on the battlefield, but everything he believed he had lost forever. The ability to protect without destroying, to feel without breaking, to love without fear. And somewhere in that silent city, a promise yet to be made was already beginning to take shape. Before this story progresses to the point where nothing can be undone, it's worth pausing for a moment. If this atmosphere has already captivated you, if the silence of this city and the weight Mark carries have begun to hold you captive, make that clear now. Your like isn't just a click. It tells the algorithm that human, profound, and cinematic stories deserve to continue being told. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapter of this journey, because what comes next changes everything. Each subscription strengthens this space where intense narratives come to life. Get lots of likes if you feel something big is about to happen. And subscribe now, because the promise made by this war veteran is only just beginning, and you'll want to be here until the end. Mark William Richard lived in a small, old wooden house on the edge of town, where the asphalt began to give way to dirt roads and the urban noise dissolved into an almost rural silence. It was the kind of place that went unnoticed, just as he preferred to live. Every morning began the same way. Before the sun had fully risen, Mark was already awake. He didn't need an alarm clock. War veterans don't trust alarms. Their bodies learn to wake up on their own, always before danger, even when the danger is no longer there. He would sit on the edge of the bed for a few seconds, feet firmly on the ground, breathing deeply, assessing his own body as he had done years before any mission. He would automatically scan his surroundings, as if he were still in hostile territory. Only then would he get up. The routine was rigid, almost military, because discipline was the only thing that kept his mind organized. Black coffee, strong, without sugar. Always in the same chipped mug, bought at a roadside gas station. The radio on low volume, never loud music. Unexpected sounds still bothered him more than he would admit. The town knew him only as Mark, the quiet man who did odd jobs, fixed fences, helped with roofs before winter, and never refused hard work. Few knew he was a war veteran, and those who did rarely brought it up. In the United States, there was a quiet respect, but also a discomfort. People didn't know what to say to someone who had seen what Mark had seen, so they chose to say nothing. He would accept that without resentment. The silence of others matched his own. Mark walked a lot around the city. He avoided driving long distances. He preferred to feel the ground beneath his feet, observe who went in and out of houses, notice subtle changes in the environment. It wasn't paranoia, it was conditioning. War veterans carry invisible maps in their minds, and each street became, for him, a perimeter to be understood. The neighbors greeted him with discreet nods. Cindy, the owner of the grocery store, always set aside the same package of coffee for him, without asking. Lainey, who lived 2 houses down, sometimes left a pie on his porch without a note. Mark never asked why, but always thanked her with a slight nod when he saw her. At night, the solitude grew denser. He would sit on the porch, watching the sky slowly darken. The crickets begin their chorus, and the lights of the houses come on one by one. There was a strange comfort in this predictability. However, behind this calm, there was a constant tension, like a rope stretched too tight. Mark avoided crowded bars, local parties, and any situation where people were too close. Enclosed spaces with many people still stirred something difficult to control. He knew exactly where the exits were, even when he tried not to think about it. The internal conflicts were silent, but incessant. Sometimes, while repairing a fence or carrying bags of cement, his mind would wander from the present without warning. A sharp sound, the crack of breaking wood, was enough to make his body react before his thoughts. He would clench his jaw, his muscles would tense, and for a second, he was no longer there. Then came the forced return, the controlled breathing, the mental reminder. You're home, this is over. But for a war veteran, some things never truly end. Mark had no family in the city. The few relatives he had left were scattered across other states, their lives having taken different paths, while his seemed to have stopped at a specific point in the past. Photographs were rare in the house, not because he had lost them all, but because he had chosen to keep them out of sight. Some memories were only bearable when kept at a distance. Even so, there were small rituals that kept him grounded. On Sundays, he would walk to the Veterans Memorial in the city center. He wouldn't stay long. Just a few minutes in silence, reading names he knew and others he had never heard of, but whom he felt were brothers. There, he wasn't just Mark. He was a war veteran among other war veterans, living or not, connected by something that words cannot express. The city accepted him as he was, reserved, efficient, distant. And Mark believed that was enough. He wasn't seeking redemption, nor a new beginning, or at least that's what he told himself. The truth was that beneath the controlled surface of his routine, there was a man tired of merely surviving, a man who had learned to live with little, to feel less, to expect nothing. But fate rarely respects carefully constructed routines. In that quiet life, marked by rigid habits and suppressed emotions, something was about to infiltrate. An unexpected detour, a test that would demand more than strength and discipline. It would require presence, empathy, and a promise he didn't yet know he would make. Mark William Richard, a war veteran, continued walking through the city believing he was invisible. But the world, slowly, began to look back at him. Long before he was known in that town as the silent man who walked alone at dusk, before he carried in his body and gaze the weight of a war veteran, Mark William Richard was just a country boy, raised in a simple house surrounded by open fields and long roads that seemed to lead anywhere in the country. He was born and raised in a small American community where everyone knew each other by their last name, where doors were rarely locked, and where a sense of duty was taught long before any personal ambition. His father, William Richard, was a mechanic and a Vietnam War veteran. A man of few words, his hands always stained with grease, and a gaze that held stories never fully told. The war was never a topic of direct conversation, but it was present in everything. In the way his father sat with his back to the wall in restaurants, in the way he woke before dawn, in the heavy silence that took over the house on certain dates of the calendar. Mark grew up observing this, without fully understanding, but absorbing each gesture as an invisible lesson. His mother, Liz Richard, was the opposite. A teacher at the local school, she deeply believed in education, empathy, and community. She balanced his father's strictness with affection, insisting that Mark read, write, and see the world beyond the limits of that town. It was with her that Mark learned values that would later come into direct conflict with the brutal reality of war: compassion, responsibility, and the belief that protecting others was a legitimate way of living. In his childhood, Mark was an attentive, observant boy. He wasn't the most talkative in the class, but he was always the first to notice when something was wrong. He defended younger classmates, helped teachers without being asked, and took on responsibilities far too early for his age. He didn't dream of being a hero, he dreamed of being useful. There was something deeply ingrained in him that pushed him toward duty, even before he understood the price it would exact. Adolescence brought difficult choices. His father was aging too quickly, his shoulders bent from years of work and unresolved memories. His mother struggled to keep the school running with limited resources. Mark saw all of this clearly and understood, even without anyone saying it, that there weren't many options. College seemed distant, both financially and emotionally. Military service, on the other hand, appeared as a direct, concrete, almost inevitable path. In the United States, the uniform still carried strong symbolism in that region. Serving was seen as an honor. And for Mark, there was also something deeper. The feeling of continuing his father's unfinished story, perhaps even correcting what he never managed to put into words. When the recruiter appeared in town, Mark listened attentively. It wasn't impulsiveness. It was a silent decision, matured over long nights, staring at the ceiling of his room, weighing what it meant to leave and what it meant to stay. On the day he signed the papers, his mother cried silently, trying to smile. His father simply nodded, a brief gesture, but one laden with pride and fear. Mark realized then that he was crossing an invisible line. He was no longer just a boy from the countryside. He was about to become something that would change his identity forever. A soldier, a future war veteran, even if he wasn't yet fully aware of what that meant. Before training, there were simple farewells, friends, teachers, neighbors, vague promises of return, lingering hugs, words that tried to sound light. Mark believed he would return the same, perhaps more experienced, perhaps stronger. He didn't imagine that war doesn't just take away what you love. It redefines who you are. Back then, his dreams were modest. He thought about returning home, working, maybe starting a family, living a quiet life. There was room for hope, for plans that didn't involve mere survival. He carried with him the values he had learned at home, believing they would be enough to face anything. He didn't yet know that, on the battlefield, those same values would be put to the test in ways no training could have predicted. This was Mark William Richards' pre-war self. An upright, quiet young man, guided by duty and the belief that doing the right thing would always have an acceptable cost. A man who did not yet know the true weight of the word veteran, nor the invisible scars that would come with it. And it was precisely this distance between who he was and who he would become that would make his journey so profoundly human and so painfully necessary. War didn't enter Mark William Richards' life as a sudden explosion, but as a slow and relentless buildup of tension, fear, and irreversible decisions. At first, there was the training, the instructor's shouts, the exhausting repetition of movements until the body responded without thinking. There, it still seemed possible to believe that it was all just technical preparation. But when Mark was sent to the conflict zone, that illusion quickly dissolved. The dry heat, the constant smell of dust mixed with fuel, the vast and indifferent sky, everything seemed to conspire to remind him that he was far from home, far from anything familiar. As a war veteran, Mark had learned that time on the battlefield didn't follow human logic. The days were too long, the nights short and restless. The silence was never truly silence, it was merely the pause between events that could change everything. He clearly remembered his first night in hostile territory, lying on the hard ground, the heavy equipment pressing against his body, his rifle always within reach. His heart pounded too hard, and every distant sound seemed like an imminent threat. No one truly slept. To sleep meant to trust, and trust was a risk few allowed themselves to take. The most persistent memories weren't of direct confrontations, but of the intervals between them, of the glances exchanged with fellow unit members, young men like himself, each carrying different stories and similar hopes. There were brief laughs, poorly told jokes, desperate attempts at normalcy. Mark remembered one of these men in particular, someone who had become almost a brother. They talked about going home, about small plans that seemed too big in that scenario. Days later, that same man was no longer there. There was no speech, no time to process the loss, just an empty space where there had once been a presence. War taught Mark to compartmentalize emotions. It was the only way to keep functioning. As a war veteran, he learned to swallow shock, sadness, and guilt, pushing it all into a deep place in his mind, promising to deal with it later. But later never came. Each mission left something behind, not just on the ground, but inside him. He began to notice certain images repeating themselves without warning, trembling hands struggling for precision, the dry sound of approaching footsteps, the fixed gaze of someone who didn't have time to react. The critical moments weren't accompanied by music or heroism. They came with confusion, split-second decisions, and consequences that stretched for years. Mark remembered situations where he had to choose quickly, knowing that any option would have a human cost. These choices would haunt him long after the mission ended. As a war veteran, he carried not only what he saw, but what he did, and what he failed to do. There were nights when the sky seemed too heavy, even years later. He remembered observing foreign stars, trying to convince himself that, somewhere under that same sky, his mother slept peacefully, without knowing exactly where her son was. These memories came laden with an almost physical longing, mixed with a constant fear of never seeing that place called home again. When the return finally happened, there was no sense of victory, just a strange emptiness, a difficulty in understanding why the world seemed to go on as normal while he felt out of place in every environment. The marks of the battlefield weren't all on his body. Some were invisible, deep, manifesting as jolts, interrupted dreams, a constant vigilance that never switched off. Mark was officially a war veteran, but he didn't feel complete, nor whole. He learned to live with these scars, as one learns to live with an old pain. Adjusting movements, avoiding certain triggers, feigning normalcy. But the truth was that the war had left fissures difficult to hide. Each loss, each extreme decision, each prolonged silence had shaped a more cautious, more withdrawn, more solitary man. Yet beneath all these layers of trauma, something essential remained. The instinct to protect, to act when others could not. Battlefield memories didn't ask permission to surface. They came in brief flashes, almost imperceptible to an outside observer. But for Mark William Richard, a war veteran, they were constant reminders that the past is never truly left behind. It merely changes form, waiting for the right moment to reappear and exact its price. For a long time, Mark William Richard believed his life would continue this way until the end. Predictable days, silent nights, no deep bonds that could be broken. For a war veteran, it seemed an acceptable agreement with the world. He didn't ask for happiness, only stability. But fate rarely respects silent agreements, especially with men who carry unfulfilled promises. The event that broke his routine didn't come with sirens or explosions. It came discreetly, almost banally, as the most dangerous things usually do. It was late afternoon when Mark was crossing the main street, carrying a bag of tools. The sky was overcast, announcing rain. That's when he heard something that didn't fit the rhythm of the city, a restrained, irregular cry coming from the alley next to the public school. His body reacted before his mind had time to rationalize. War veterans don't ignore out-of-place sounds. Mark changed course without thinking. Silent steps, alert posture. The alley was narrow, poorly lit, with damp brick walls and accumulated trash in the corners. It was there that he saw the girl. She couldn't have been more than 9 years old. She was huddled against the wall, her backpack pressed against her chest like a makeshift shield. Her face was stained with tears, her eyes wide with fear. Two teenagers were a few steps away from her, laughing softly, saying things Mark couldn't hear clearly. But the tone was enough. He knew that tone well. It was the same tone that precedes violence. Mark didn't shout. He didn't run. He approached with controlled calm, the same calm he used years ago when he needed to de-escalate situations before everything spiraled out of control. His presence was enough. The teenagers noticed him, quickly assessing that tall, rigid man, his gaze too firm to be ignored. One of them murmured something, and the two walked away, disappearing down the side street. The girl didn't move. She continued trembling, as if still expecting the worst. Mark kept his distance, lowering his body slightly so as not to appear threatening. He spoke a few words, his voice low and firm. He asked if she was hurt. She shook her head negatively, but didn't speak. Her silence said it all. It wasn't until he accompanied her to the front of the school that she finally spoke her name. Lainey. She lived 3 blocks away. Normally, her mother picked her up, but that day something had gone wrong. Mark listened attentively to every detail. He didn't interrupt. He never rushed someone in shock. War veterans know that speaking is a process. At the school gate, a woman approached hurriedly, visibly worried. Her hair was simply tied back, she wore modest clothes, and her gaze mixed tiredness and determination. When she saw Lainey, she ran to her and enveloped her in a hug that was too strong to be casual. Then, she looked up at Mark. That was the first time he saw Cindy. She introduced herself as a teacher from the school. Lainey's mother was late, and Cindy, realizing the girl was alone, had started looking for her. The thanks came quickly, sincerely, but laden with something deeper. Relief. Mark simply nodded, saying that anyone would have done the same. But they both knew that wasn't true. Before saying goodbye, Cindy hesitated. She asked if Mark lived nearby. He confirmed. She explained carefully that this wasn't the first time Lainey had faced problems on that route. There were people watching, waiting for moments of vulnerability. The small town was beginning to show dangerous cracks. It was there that something shifted inside Mark. An old feeling, buried beneath layers of control and isolation. He looked at Lainey, then at Cindy, and felt the weight of a responsibility that wasn't officially his, but that somehow had already taken hold. As a war veteran, he knew that feeling well. It was the same feeling that arose before accepting a mission that no one else wanted to take on. That night, Mark couldn't follow his routine. He sat on the porch, the distant sound of rain hitting the roof, the image of the girl huddled in the alley repeating in his mind. He tried to rationalize, to tell himself it wasn't his problem, that the city had authorities, that he didn't need to get involved. But that voice was too weak compared to another, older, more powerful one. The memory of promises made in the past, some kept, others broken, began to resurface. He knew that by getting involved, he would be opening doors he had kept closed for years. But he also knew that ignoring it would have an even greater cost. For a war veteran, there are battles that do not allow for neutrality. The following morning, Mark made a simple but definitive decision. He would observe the route to school. He wouldn't make a fuss. He wouldn't draw attention. He would simply be there. Present, vigilant, protective. Not because someone formally asked him to, but because something inside him demanded it. Without realizing it, Mark William Richard had accepted a new mission. Unofficial, unrecognized, but deeply personal. And like all missions that truly matter, it began not with orders, but with a silent promise. Mark William Richard's decision was neither announced nor discussed with anyone. It simply materialized in the form of presence. The morning after the incident in the alley, he woke even earlier than usual. The sky was grey, heavy, as if anticipating something. Mark put on the same worn coat, carefully slipped on his boots, and left home before the city had fully awakened. For a war veteran, action was never about noise or recognition. It was always about being in the right place, at the right time, ready for whatever came. He positioned himself at a strategic distance from the school, close enough to observe, far enough away not to attract attention. He leaned against a fence, pretending to check something in his tool bag. His eyes, however, scanned everything. Who passed by, who stopped too long, who changed direction upon noticing the movement around them. It was automatic, almost involuntary behavior. The war had taught him to read patterns, and that area had patterns he didn't like. When Lainey appeared at the end of the street, walking with small, cautious steps that were too careful for someone her age, something tightened in Mark's chest. He maintained a neutral posture, but his focus intensified. The girl carried her backpack as if it were too heavy and looked around frequently. Mark didn't approach. He simply followed her at a distance, adjusting his own pace to hers. No sudden movements, no heroic gestures, just constant vigilance. Across the street, he noticed the same two teenagers from the previous day, leaning against a wall, pretending to talk, but too attentive to the movement. Mark felt his body go into a state of alert. There was no anger in his reaction, only calculation. As a war veteran, he knew that direct confrontation was rarely the best option. The goal was to protect, not to escalate. When the teenagers took their first step toward Lainey, Mark moved. He didn't run. He simply crossed the street firmly, positioning himself naturally between them and the girl. His gaze met theirs, and there was no explicit threat there. Only the silent certainty that this wouldn't continue. The young men hesitated. They recognized something they couldn't name, but which they had instinctively learned to respect. They retreated again, murmuring something irrelevant, and disappeared. Lainey entered the school without fully realizing what had happened. For Mark, this was ideal. The best protection is the one that leaves no additional scars. He stayed there for a few more minutes, making sure everything was normal, before walking away. This ritual repeated itself in the following days. Always discreet, always attentive. Mark adapted his routine to be present during critical times. He began to recognize faces, cars, schedules. He didn't ask permission, nor did he expect thanks. This wasn't a favor, it was a commitment that was beginning to confront him in unexpected ways. Internally, the conflict was intense. Each morning brought with it the weight of old memories. Being on guard awakened sensations he had spent years trying to suppress. His body reacted as if it were once again in hostile territory. Sometimes, upon returning home, Mark felt a weariness that didn't stem from physical exertion, but from the internal battle to keep the past where it belonged. It was Cindy who first noticed that something had changed. She noticed the constant presence of that quiet man near the school. It didn't take her long to understand. One day, she approached him at the end of the workday. She thanked him again, but this time more carefully, as if recognizing something greater than a simple gesture of help. Mark tried to downplay it, as always. He said it was nothing. Cindy didn't insist, but her gaze told her she knew the truth. As the weeks passed, Mark began to get more directly involved, albeit reluctantly. He started guiding Lainey on safer routes, observing problem areas, and discreetly talking to some people in the community. He never presented himself as a war veteran, but his demeanor betrayed an experience that went beyond the ordinary. He applied skills learned in chaos with a different purpose now, to preserve, not eliminate. This new role demanded more than just technique. It demanded humanity. At times, Mark found himself smiling discreetly as he watched Lainey enter the school more confidently. At other times, he felt a pang in his chest, realizing how much that simple act of protection made him feel useful again, and vulnerable. He knew he was crossing a dangerous, emotional line. The more he cared, the greater the risk of losing. That night, sitting on the porch, Mark reflected on the irony of the situation, on how he had spent years trying to avoid any kind of mission, only to accept one that involved no orders, badges, or recognition. Just real people, real risks, and consequences that couldn't be ignored. As a war veteran, he had learned to live with the weight of decisions. Now, he was learning something harder, to live with the weight of caring. Mark's act of courage wasn't a one-off event, nor a dramatic gesture. It was a daily choice. A silent choice to remain present, even when every instinct told him to walk away. And without realizing it, by protecting that girl, he slowly began to protect parts of himself that he believed were lost forever. What began as silent surveillance soon turned into something far more dangerous than Mark William Richard had anticipated. For a war veteran, danger rarely presents itself explicitly. It infiltrates, observes, tests limits. And the city, which had previously seemed merely asleep, began to reveal a less innocent side. Mark noticed it first in the details. A dark car parked in different locations, always at the same times. New faces circulating near the school with no apparent connection to students or staff. Conversations interrupted when he approached. This wasn't paranoia, it was a pattern. And patterns, he had learned the hard way, almost always preceded bigger problems. The conflict intensified the day Lainey didn't show up at her usual time. Mark was at his observation post when the flow of children dwindled until it ceased. The gate closed. The bell rang, and Lainey didn't come through it. An immediate weight settled in his chest. He tried to rationalize. Late, unexpected, anything common. Still, instinct prevailed. He walked to the school for the first time since undertaking this silent mission. As he entered, he felt something old awaken. The sensation of crossing a perimeter without knowing what awaited him. Cindy saw him almost immediately. Her face changed as she perceived the tension contained within him. Before Mark could say anything, she confirmed the fear they both shared. Lainey hadn't arrived. The silence that followed was thick. Cindy tried to call the girl's mother, without success. The school administration began standard procedures, but to Mark it all seemed too slow, too impersonal. He hadn't disrespected anyone, but he made it clear, with the firm calm of someone who doesn't accept no for an answer, that he would look into it himself. From that moment on, the conflict ceased to be merely external. Mark felt the carefully constructed layers of control begin to crack. The search awakened in him something he knew all too well: absolute urgency, the need to act quickly, to anticipate movements. But now there were no clear rules, no chain of command. Just an ordinary city and a child who wasn't where he should be. He began by following Lainey's usual route, analyzing each stretch as if it were hostile terrain. He observed marks on the ground, small signs that would go unnoticed by anyone else. A piece of fabric caught on a fence, recent footprints veering off the usual path. The war veteran within him took complete control, while the human part struggled not to be swallowed by fear. Cindy insisted on going with him, despite Mark's initial resistance. He knew it increased the emotional risk, but he also understood that pushing her away would be impossible. As they moved forward, the tension between them grew. Cindy wasn't fragile, but she also wasn't prepared for the kind of reality Mark was beginning to see. He tried to protect her, not just physically, but from the harsher truth. Someone had been watching that child for far too long. The conflict escalated when Mark recognized one of the faces he had seen days before. A man standing near an abandoned building, pretending to use his cell phone. When he realized he was being watched, he quickly moved away. For Mark, that was confirmation enough. It was no longer casual intimidation. There was intent, planning. At that moment, the internal conflict exploded with full force. Mark felt the past violently collide with the present. The same sensations of missions gone wrong, the same impossible choices. The difference now was devastating. This time, there wasn't enough emotional shielding to separate the mission from the people involved. Lainey had a face. Cindy had a name, a voice, a gaze that was beginning to occupy dangerous spaces within him. The city, once neutral, now seemed like an emotional minefield. Every street was a possibility. Every decision, a risk. Mark found himself confronted with the greatest difficulty since returning from the war, accepting that he couldn't control everything. As a war veteran, he had been trained to act under extreme pressure. But he had never been trained to deal with the fear of losing someone he was still learning to love. The greater conflict wasn't just finding Lainey. It was preventing the man Mark had become on the battlefield from making irreversible decisions. It was balancing precision with compassion, strength with restraint. He knew that one wrong step could destroy everything he was trying to protect. As the search stretched into the early evening, with distant sirens and the city beginning to realize something was wrong, Mark felt the overwhelming weight of responsibility. He was involved. There was no turning back. This was not a mission that could be abandoned. The war veteran, who had survived impossible scenarios, now faced an even crueler conflict, saving a child without losing his own humanity, and without allowing the past to dictate the outcome. Night fell too quickly, as if someone had extinguished the light in the sky without warning. The sirens in the distance were no longer just a distant sound. They were a constant reminder that time was running out. Mark William Richard walked with Cindy along a back road, lined with tall trees and abandoned warehouses, places forgotten by the city and too perfect for someone who didn't want to be seen. Each step seemed heavier than the last. Not from physical exhaustion, but from the accumulation of everything he had been trying to keep under control since returning from the war. It was there, in that isolated stretch, that the collapse began. Mark stopped abruptly. His body froze as if he had encountered an invisible barrier. The air seemed thicker, difficult to breathe. The smell of damp earth, mixed with the rusty metal of the shed, brought back such a vivid memory that the present began to dissolve. For a moment, he was no longer on that American road. He was back in a distant place, under an equally dark sky, where decisions made in seconds had cost entire lives. The sound of a door slamming in the wind echoed, dry and repetitive. That was enough. The images came without asking permission. Fallen comrades, voices calling for help that didn't arrive in time. The crushing weight of the responsibility of having survived when others didn't. Mark put his hand to his chest, trying to control his breathing, but his body didn't obey as before. The war veteran, always firm, always calculating, was being pulled into the worst possible place: memory. Cindy immediately realized something was wrong. She called his name, touched his arm, but Mark didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on nothing, or perhaps on everything at once. He felt the ground disappear beneath his feet, replaced by sand, debris, muffled screams. The distant sound of sirens transformed in his mind into something very different, something ancient, something he had never been able to completely silence. I failed, he thought, not knowing exactly which moment that phrase referred to. The mission from years ago, the promise not made. Or that child who was now missing while he struggled to stay on his feet. That's where the real break happened. Mark fell to his knees, his breathing ragged, his hands pressed against his head as if to stop the memories from flooding back. There was no heroism in that moment, no strength. Just a man broken by the accumulated weight of everything he had tried to carry alone. As a war veteran, he had learned to endure the trauma in silence, but the silence was finally taking its toll. Cindy knelt before him, gently cupping his face, forcing him to look at her. Her eyes were teary, but steady. She spoke to him as one speaks to someone on the verge of complete loss. Not with fear, not with pity, with presence, with humanity. Her words didn't erase the memories, but they created an anchor, something real, something in the present. Mark began, little by little, to return. His breathing slowed, the trembling in his hands lessened, but the emotional damage was done. He felt exposed, vulnerable in a way he had never allowed himself to feel since becoming a war veteran. "I can't lose another child," he finally said, his voice hoarse, almost unrecognizable. It wasn't just about Lainey. It was about all the losses that had accumulated inside him, nameless, without proper mourning. Cindy understood this immediately. She didn't try to minimize it. She didn't try to say that everything would be all right. She just stayed there with him, sharing the weight of that moment. It was then that Mark realized how deeply involved he was, how much that mission was no longer just an extension of his war instincts. It was personal, dangerously personal. And that scared him more than any external threat. Because losing Lainey would mean more than failing to protect someone. It would mean confirming the cruelest belief he had carried since the battlefield, that everything he touches ends up breaking. When he finally stood up, something had changed. It wasn't confidence. It was determination mixed with fear, an unstable but powerful combination. Mark knew he was at his limit, that this collapse was a clear warning that he couldn't continue like this for much longer. But he also knew that giving up now would be an impossible wound to heal. In the distance, a faint light appeared near the abandoned warehouse, a subtle, almost imperceptible movement. Cindy saw it too. The moment of rupture hadn't ended. It had merely transformed. Now Mark would have to act not despite the pain, but through it. The war veteran who had survived the worst of the past was facing the most vulnerable point of his entire journey. One step forward meant confronting not only the person who had taken Lainey, but everything he had been avoiding feeling for years. And for the first time since returning home, Mark William Richard wasn't sure if he would emerge unscathed from this battle. But he knew, with absolute clarity, that he would not back down. The faint light that emerged in the distance was not constant. It flickered irregularly, as if someone were trying to decide whether or not to be seen. For Mark William Richard, that detail was enough. The war veteran felt his entire body enter a state he knew well. Not the panic of the recent collapse, but the cold clarity that arose when everything around him seemed about to crumble. It was the state that had kept him alive in scenarios where error was not allowed. He made a discreet gesture for Cindy to stay behind. It wasn't a spoken order, but she understood. There was something in the way he moved, in his firm posture, despite the emotional strain, that made it clear this was not a negotiable territory. Still, Cindy didn't back away completely. She stayed close enough to see, far enough away not to interfere. She trusted him now in a way that didn't need words. Mark slowly advanced toward the abandoned warehouse. Each step was calculated. He observed the ground, the shadows, the possible entry and exit points. The war had taught him that abandoned places are never truly empty, they merely conceal intentions. The silence there was too thick, heavy with expectation. Mark's heart pounded, but his breathing was controlled. There was no room for hesitation. As he approached, he heard a muffled sound, a stifled sob. His body reacted immediately. There was no longer any doubt. Lainey was there. The final conflict began within him before any external confrontation. Mark felt the old urge to act with full force, to neutralize any threat without room for error. But something held him back. Perhaps it was Cindy's gaze still present in his mind. Perhaps it was the silent promise he had made to himself when undertaking that mission. Or perhaps it was the hardest lesson of his entire life. Protecting does not mean destroying. He entered through the side of the shed, taking advantage of an opening in the rotting wood. The interior was dark, illuminated only by a flashlight left on the floor. Two men were there. One of them was speaking softly on the phone, impatient. The other was closer to Lainey, who remained seated, frightened but conscious. There was no explicit violence at that moment, only control, intimidation, and waiting. Mark positioned himself behind a fallen metal structure. He quickly assessed the distances, the possible movements, the risks. There was no time to wait for reinforcements. This decision would be his, alone, like so many others before. The difference now was what was at stake. When one of the men turned around, Mark stepped out of the shadows. His voice was firm, controlled, without raising his tone. He said only what was necessary. The effect was immediate. The men froze for a second, surprised by his unexpected presence. That second was all Mark needed. He advanced with precision, using his body to position himself between them and Laney. There were no unnecessary blows, only quick, efficient movements, learned in contexts where survival depended on it. The confrontation was brief, intense, and silent. One of the men tried to fight back, but underestimated the lethal calm of someone who had already faced the worst of humanity and survived. Mark immobilized them both, using just enough force to prevent any further threat. There was no hatred in his gestures, only determination. When it was all over, the shed fell silent again. Mark turned slowly to Laney. The girl looked at him with eyes full of fear, but also of recognition. He knelt in front of her, lowering himself to her eye level. He spoke softly, assuring her that she was safe now, that it was all over. Laney stood up slowly and, without saying anything, hugged Mark tightly. The impact of that gesture was greater than any physical confrontation. The war veteran felt something break inside him, not from pain, but from release. He closed his eyes for a moment, allowing himself to feel, allowing himself to be present. When Cindy entered the shed and saw the scene, she brought her hand to her mouth, unable to hold back the tears. That moment sealed something between them. And not a romance yet, but a profound recognition. They had been through something together that could not be undone. The sirens drew closer rapidly. Mark only moved away from Laney when necessary. He explained everything clearly, objectively, without dramatization. The authorities took control. He didn't seek praise or recognition. As a war veteran, he knew that true triumph is rarely celebrated with applause. When it was all over, when the warehouse was sealed off and the city began to breathe a sigh of relief, Mark felt strangely empty, and yet whole. He had faced his greatest fear, to act again, to get involved, to protect someone knowing he could lose. And this time, he hadn't backed down. Overcoming this didn't come as a grand moment, but as a silent certainty. Mark William Richard realized he was no longer just a survivor of the past. He had chosen to be present in the now, chose to fight not for orders or abstract duty, but for real people. The war veteran, bearing invisible scars, had fought the hardest battle of all, the one against himself, and, for the first time in many years, emerged from it without feeling he had lost anything in the process. Dawn arrived slowly, as if the city itself needed care after the night that nearly split it in two. The soft sunlight touched the rooftops, the trees, and the still damp streets, revealing a world that seemed the same as before, but which, for Mark William Richard, would never be the same. He sat on his porch, hands resting on his knees, his body weary in a different way. It wasn't the weariness of fear or constant tension, it was the weariness of someone who had overcome something definitive. As a war veteran, Mark had always believed that certain chapters of life ended unceremoniously, with only survivors and silence. But that morning, the silence had a different texture. It wasn't emptiness. It was space. Space to breathe without watching every shadow. Space to remember without being dragged into memories. For the first time in many years, he was able to observe the horizon without feeling the need to anticipate the worst. The city reacted to the events with that typical mix of shock and denial. There were hushed comments, lingering stares, unspoken gratitude. Some residents began to greet him differently, with explicit respect. Mark accepted it with his usual discretion. He didn't want to be a symbol of anything, just someone who did what needed to be done. Laney returned to school a few days later. She walked with firmer steps, her backpack hanging lightly from one shoulder. When she saw Mark across the street, she smiled. A simple, childlike smile, but full of meaning. He responded with a discreet nod, feeling something align within his chest. The silent promise had been fulfilled. Cindy began visiting him more often, sometimes to thank him again, sometimes just to talk. They didn't always talk about what had happened. Most of the time, they talked about ordinary things, school, the city, little stories from everyday life. But there was a deep understanding between them that needed no explanation. Cindy saw Mark not just as a war veteran, but as a whole man, wounded, yes, but capable of care, presence, and affection. Mark realized that love hadn't arrived as a sudden invasion. It had arrived as a slow, patient, respectful construction. A love that didn't demand that he be different from who he was, only that he be there. And that for someone who had spent years believing he didn't belong anywhere was a silent revelation. The nights had changed. Sleep still came cautiously, but the nightmares began to lose their power. When they did appear, they no longer dominated. Mark had learned something essential. Memories don't need to disappear to lose their power. They only need to be accompanied by something alive in the present. As a war veteran, he had always believed that carrying the past was a life sentence. Now he understood that it was possible to carry the past without allowing it to define the future. He returned to the Veterans Memorial on a sunny Sunday. He read the names, as always. But this time he lingered longer, not in mourning but in recognition. Recognition of all that had been lost, and of all that could still be built. He didn't feel healed in the simple sense of the word, but he felt whole enough to continue. The small town continued its rhythm. Children returned to the park. The creaking swing now held laughter. The night silence ceased to be a threat and became a place of rest. And Mark William Richard began to walk the streets, not only as an attentive observer, but as someone who belonged there. In the end, that war veteran's journey wasn't about defeating visible enemies. It was about confronting the harshest belief the war had instilled in him, that he was condemned to live on the margins, alone, always on alert. By protecting a child, he rediscovered the man who existed before the uniform. By allowing himself to love, he found something even rarer than survival: purpose. And perhaps this is the truth that remains when the noise of battle finally dies down. Not every war ends when the guns fall silent. Some only end when we choose, despite fear, to protect the life that can still flourish. Because in the end, it is not the war that defines a veteran. It is what he decides to save after it. If you've made it this far, it's because this story touched you in some way. And that's exactly why this channel exists. To tell stories that stay with you, that accompany you long after the video ends. If this resonates with you, subscribe to the channel to continue receiving stories like this, told calmly, in depth, and with respect for the viewer. If you want, leave a comment writing, "I made it to the end." Not for me, but for yourself, as someone who acknowledges that you stayed until the very last scene. And if this journey created any connection, the like is just a simple way to signal that. There's a video over here that directly addresses this story and delves deeper into the same sentiment. Click on it and continue watching it with me. We'll see each other in the next chapter.